Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Acclaimed TV writer and the executive producer of award-winning shows such as Modern Family and How I Met Your Mother, Stephen Lloyd's new novel, his debut, is Friend of the Devil, a horror noir mashup set at an elite boarding school harboring secrets. Lloyd delves into the supernatural with this very funny and hard-boiled look at dark academia, following a one-of-a-kind private eye and his unlikely sidekick. Stephen Lloyd is a TV producer and writer, best known, as I mentioned, for Modern Family, How I Met Your Mother, Stacked, and Just Shoot Me. It's a great pleasure to welcome Stephen Lloyd to this week's book show. Stephen, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a real pleasure to have you, and it's a real pleasure to have read this novel. How long has this been in you, the idea to write a novel and to write this type of novel?
A long time. I sort of had the idea of something going wrong like this at a boarding school, and the idea of Sam. And it just sort of coalesced over time. It was just something I was doing in my spare time when I would come home from work. But it's been a few years, actually, in the making. At least the Sam part. The Harriet part came later.
Okay, we'll get into Sam and Harriet in just a second. Let's talk a little bit about what the book's about, because it is ultimately a private eye story. There's supernatural elements to it, but it all begins when a book goes missing.
Yes, it is. Yeah, at its heart, it's a detective story. It follows Sam Gregory, who is a Vietnam vet. It takes place in the early 80s, so he's pretty recently returned from the war. And he now works as an insurance investigator. And his company has insured a priceless medieval manuscript that has gone missing. And he has to go find out if it was stolen, or if he can, or if there's fraud, or if he can reclaim it, or if they have to pay the claim. And that lands him in Danforth, Putnam, which is this sort of impossibly wealthy boarding school. They have their own island off the coast of Massachusetts, where he does not feel particularly comfortable. But he pursues his investigation. He feels like it's pretty straightforward at first, but then witchy stuff starts to happen. He realizes that the book has some sort of witchy stuff in it, and there's some supernatural things, and then bad things start to happen on the island.
Is that a genre you have enjoyed in the past and wanted to explore?
Yes. I mean, I'm a huge Chandler fan, so I always loved that kind of hard-boiled fiction, but I also love speculative fiction. So it was fun to be able to mash that up with some supernatural elements. Because like Harriet, I was a D&D nerd in high school, so I liked, putting that in there.
So bring us to a little bit about Harriet. This is a character who Sam ultimately joins forces with a bit to try to figure out what's going on at the school. So tell us about this character.
Harriet's a student at the school. She's African American. It's the early 80s, so she's, not made to feel particularly comfortable at this tough, boarding school. She's also kind of a nerd. She's the head of the D&D club and the astronomy club. And she and her friends get bullied a lot, and she's sick of it. So she she wants to write this investigative report on bullying at the school for the school paper. And while she's doing that, she stumbles on some of the same supernatural weirdness that Sam does. So their investigations start to collide, and then they end up becoming sort of oddly friends, and this all ends up reaching a what I hope is a very shocking twist at the end.
Yeah, a very shocking twist. I think somewhere in the book it talks about the amount of blood, but there is a lot of blood. That's fun.
There's a lot of blood. Yeah, there's quite a bit of blood.
And although it is different reading about it than obviously seeing it, isn't there?
Maybe it's worse, that you have to sort of imagine it. They say, like, whatever you're going to imagine is worse than whatever you would see actually on the screen. So, well, yeah. I apologize to anybody who was put off by the amount of blood that is in this.
As you mentioned, this takes place at a boarding school, a very, very elite boarding school, and yes, it has its own island. What brought you to a boarding school? It could have been a more traditional sort of noir setting, but you went to a boarding school and one that's cut off from the rest of the world.
I think, most of us would agree. High school's I had a pretty easy go of it in high school, and I went to a public school.
Yeah.
But it's a rough place, and all the craziness that teenagers are going through. I think putting them at a boarding school where there are no parents around, especially on an island, just seemed like a formula for some really bad Lord of the Flies stuff, which is why I wanted to put it there. And it just also seemed that it makes it that much, to me, as a parent, that much more terrifying that this stuff is happening and teenagers are having to deal with it.
Right. And just, I mean, besides the stuff that you have made up, I mean, just the regular stuff is scary enough. And it's yeah, you wonder how that became a thing, even to just put all your kids into one room and say, oh, good luck.
Yeah, I know you are all like, raging full of hormones and are basically little more than children emotionally and mentally, even though some of you can bench press 200 pounds. But there you go. Good luck.
And you explore that with various characters in the novel, and it's fascinating because they all seem to be represented of those types, the Breakfast Club types, if you will, and
Sure.
but that is high school. That's what makes that up, right? Whether it's a prep school or a public school.
Yeah, it's a big mix of people that are forced to sort of get along, and they don't always have the best tools to do so. I think we're better about that now, at least I want to think, in terms of being on bullying and making sure everybody gets along. But in the early 80s, they really just kind of threw you into the deep end of the pool and said, make it work.
Right.
And, it didn't always.
What year did you graduate high school?
1983.
Okay, I graduated in 85. So just about there.
Yeah.
And it seems like, and that's very reminiscent in the novel of that time, which I don't know, maybe over the years, I don't know for you, but for me has just become goofier.
Yes, absolutely. It seemed at the time like, wow, look at the craziness of the 70s. We're so much more restrained now. And you look back at it now and it's just silly. It is crazy. But there's a lot of similarities between then and now too.
You have a character in the book that you describe early on as wearing a Reagan button the size of a hubcap. I had that guy in my class. I had that kid in my class.
Me too. I had a lot of them. And I wondered where they came from. It was so odd. Like I just, because I was a kid, so I wasn't really appreciating it then. But, suddenly seeing these kids screaming at their teachers for being too liberal. You're like, what is going on? But that's what the 80s was a lot.
You explore some really interesting themes in the book with Sam. Sam is a guy who's really broken and haunted. His time in Vietnam has taken its toll. As you said, he is an insurance investigator, and he's very sure of himself, but certainly has his issues.
Yes, absolutely. He's a very haunted by his wartime experience, and he's trying to keep it under wraps in not necessarily the healthiest ways. He's self-medicating and just trying to sort of ignore it and power through it, which unfortunately was what was available really back in the early 80s to a lot of these guys returning from Vietnam. PTSD had, I think, was just a word. They had just been starting to call it that then. It was pretty much shell shock before then, and they really weren't given a lot of help. Even now, I think according to a friend of mine, about 50% of them are getting the care that they need. And back in the 80s, it was like nothing.
Right.
So he is sort of trudging through, kind of broken. And we do see the effect that has on him in terms of the investigation. And towards the end of the book, realize that his wartime experience is much more complicated than we thought, and has certainly affected the investigation in ways that maybe we didn't realize. I hope.
No, absolutely. And for that moment, you also remember that, yeah, here's a book that is taking place in the early 80s, which is not that far removed from his war experiences. So it's that's a wound that isn't even slightly healed yet.
No, he's still a young guy. It's only like a few years earlier. Yeah.
Stephen Lloyd is our guest on the book show this week. The name of the new novel is Friend of the Devil. It is published by Putnam. The idea of these two characters, and you touched on this when you were talking about them, but Harriet is a kid who has this in common with Sam: is they both really don't like this boarding school culture. They're both annoyed
Right.
by it, right? And
Yeah.
one has to live in it, the other one is experiencing it. Neither one of them want to be there, but they're also very, very clear that they want to find out what's going on. They don't want to be left out of anything.
Yes, exactly. I think that's what bonds them. They both have, you know, both of them, it drives them crazy to not know what's going on. They need to get to the bottom of things. And I think they're opposites in some ways, in that Sam is a big buff Marine with a working class roots, but he's very sort of damaged emotionally and he's kind of fragile internally. And Harriet's the opposite. She's very fragile physically. She's small. She has epilepsy, but she's just tenacious and won't take no for an answer and just sort of plows forward. And Sam really admires that in her, and also her kind of heightened sense of justice, that she's going to get to she's not going to let people mess with her and her friends, especially. But also, as you say, like they bond over not really liking this place, not fitting in very well, having a kind of contempt for it, and wanting to get to the bottom of what's going on there.
I really like the whole idea that this whole mystery, the entire mystery, revolves around a book, a missing
Yeah.
book. That's really cool because this book has all kinds of interest to it and in it. And it isn't the normal thing that you would think would lead to a lot of slashing.
Yes, it starts out with a pretty dry premise, and I think Sam even gives voice to that in the first chapter. Like, well, who cares about a
Yeah,
missing
right.
book, especially because they're outside a part of Massachusetts that is pretty poor and dealing with a lot of crime, and it's like, you hear about a missing book, like, cry me a river. So it is supposed to seem sort of banal.
And when you look at the private school and you really nail that world, as you said, you were a public school student. So what kind of research did you do on that, of the boarding school
Well,
life?
a lot of my friends went to boarding schools, and I remember in college, like most of my friends and roommates went to college schools, and I remember listening to their stories and just couldn't believe it, because I thought, you know, the kids in my school got up to stuff that was like, bad, and they did. The plenty of bad stuff happens, in anybody's high school. But when I think of the things that they got away with and the things that they were doing, it just was shocking to me. And I loved sort of hearing these stories, but was also sort of shocked by them. So I think I filed a lot of those away. That was mostly, it comes from the experiences of my friends and rules like that.
When you start a project like this, as you say, you have long wanted to do this. So once you commit yourself to it, how long did it take you?
I kind of a short story novella about Sam, and I think that took about maybe 6 months or something. And then because I don't know anything about the book business or anything,
Yeah.
I gave it to my managers, who gave it to fantastic literary agent Richard Abate in New York, who gave it to Mark Tavani at Putnam, fantastic editor who worked on this, and he read it and said, "You need to expand it." I was I didn't want it to be sluggish because it's a thriller. So I was struggling, like, how do you because every time I reread anything that I wrote, I want to cut stuff out. I never want to add, because I want to keep it going. But then my wife said, "Well, think about a whole new character," and so that's when I thought of Harriet. And adding Harriet probably took another 4 months, I think,
Mm.
integrating those two, and then also that affected the end a lot because the end was different. My editor and I talked about different ways to end the book, but finally ended in one that I think possibly promises sequels and things to come. So between the two, I guess 10 months to a year, I guess, in terms of the bulk of the writing.
And when you start to play around with it and figure out that you're going to give this a new ending, that seems fun. That seems like you've taken this group of characters and you say, okay, what can I do with them to get to this point?
Yeah, it was fun. It's also a little intimidating. I found, like, wrapping stuff up. I took a few cracks at it, and my editor, to his credit, said, "Look, it's your book. You can wrap it up the way you want to, but I'm not sure you've nailed it just yet." And he was right. But I do think I finally found a way to it. But it's intimidating to sort of wrap things up because if you're like, well, this is my sign off, this better be good. But I do like the way it wraps up currently because I think it does promise future adventures.
Once again, the name of the book is Friend of the Devil by Stephen Lloyd. It is published by Putnam. You certainly come by your career honestly. Talk a little bit about both your dad and your brother who also share in the family business.
Yeah, well, my dad was a TV writer. He started out as a gag writer for Jack Parr, and then stayed in late night television. He wrote for Johnny Carson and a lot of those shows that came out of 30 Rock in the 60s and 70s. And then he was asked to sort of come out to Los Angeles and work on the show that was starting up, that happened to be the Mary Tyler Moore Show, where he was a sitcom writer for many years, and not on the Mary Tyler Moore Show and several of the other NTM shows, and then on Taxi and Cheers and those things. And my brother started on the Golden Girls pretty soon out of college, which I think was his first job in TV, and turned out to be a big hit. And he segued from that to Wings, and then Frasier, which he ran for a long time, and then he created Modern Family with Steve Levitan, and which obviously ended a couple of years ago. I kind of started in. I went to film school, and I started out working sort of in the New York independent film scene, and then I came out. I sold a script to Warner Brothers on spec that I got to the producer of the movie that I was working on, basically as a PA. And I worked in features for a little bit, and then segued from that into cable TV, and then from that I got a job on Just Shoot Me with Steve Levitan, who co-created Modern Family with my brother Chris. And then
it all comes full circle. Then
small group. And then I worked on How I Met Your Mother for almost entire run, 9 or 10 years. And when that ended, that was a 20th Century Fox show. I moved over to to Modern Family, which had already been on for several years, and I was there for the last 6 years of the run of that show.
Okay, so a lot of follow-up questions. Number one, what's it like working with your brother?
It's funny, like, those old dynamics never go away. You go back and suddenly you're still like a little brother, big brother in many ways. And that's hard to shake no matter how old you get. But I think we both tried to just sort of pretend that we were not brothers and make it a very professional relationship, and just say, here we're just colleagues and we're coworkers. And so tried to just sort of put that aside.
How aware were you of your father's work and who he was working for? I mean, just the Jack Parr connection alone is really, amazing. And as far as TV history goes, as well as Carson, of course, is amazing.
It's a great question, and and it's the truth was not much, because growing up, like, you don't really think that much about what your dad does for a living. Like, he could have sold insurance for all we know. I mean, he went to work, he came home, and he talked about it a little at the dinner table. But I had I had no idea what goes on in a TV writing room until I was working in one. Basically, it was like, oh, this is what my dad did for a living. Like, I really didn't have any clear concept of it. And also, writers are a little bit siloed from the process. You're not, as a writer, hanging out with celebrities and going out on press tours, whatever. It's much more of just a a
Right.
job. He was at his typewriter in his a little back house, like, writing scripts most of the time. So I was aware of it, but I really didn't have a very clear picture of what it was until I was an adult, and then was like, oh, that I was able to put it in perspective.
Okay, so I'm going to explore this just one more question, and that is: so your dad is partially responsible for writing the very famous "Chuckles Bites the Dust" episode of Mary
Hmm.
Tyler Moore, won an Emmy. So you
Yeah,
you have to be fairly aware that that's a big deal, right?
for sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, and at the time, it was very exciting. I was a little kid, but I remember thinking, "Oh, that's exciting! Dad's going to the Emmys, and he won an Emmy." But it you know it has become a very um, iconic episode of television over time. And now, looking back, yeah, it's certainly like, oh wow, that's kind of amazing. My dad wrote that episode.
What did he think of? Did he have views on your work? Did he ever talk to you about your work?
Um, not too much. My dad passed away about 12 years ago.
Right.
So we didn't intersect too much. He did read my first TV specs, and he was very positive about them. He said they're great, but then again, that's also my dad talking, so it's he's not a little bit biased there.
Right.
But we didn't. I wouldn't say we talked shop too much, because I did start in features, and I had a little bit of a different career trajectory at first.
You worked on a show, at least I believe you did, that I thought was really cool. It didn't last very long, unfortunately. It was called Stacked. It
Uh-huh.
was on it was on
Hmm.
Fox, and Pam Anderson was on it, and it was a show about a bookstore, and it was a really neat idea, I thought, which seemed like it would be fun.
It was fun. It was Steve Levitan created that show as well. It was very short lived, but it it was um, it was a nice group of people. Elon Gold, who played the sort of
Yeah.
nervous, is a neighbor of mine. I see his kids playing, like, stick hockey all the time out on the street, and it was a nice group of people, and it was the it seemed like a solid premise. You've got a fussy bookstore owner, and then Pam Anderson walks in. That's an unlikely opposition, but it did not. Yeah, audiences did not fall in love with it,
what
unfortunately.
what is it like? I mean, you've
Mhm.
had both experiences, I assume, of shows with great success, and then a show like that did not do as well. What is it like being in the writers' room, knowing that you're writing for a show that people may or may not be watching?
Well, the good news is you don't do it for very long,
Right.
because, like, once they like, they're pretty quick to cancel a show that isn't finding an audience. So pretty fast, it's time
Yeah.
to look for a new job if the show isn't working. So yeah, it's a little depressing, but the axe falls quick. So at least it's over fast.
How aware were you of writing the humor, writing comedy while writing this novel, Friend of the Devil?
Not very. I was actually surprised by the reaction of many people saying, like, "Oh wow, it's really funny," which I thought, wow, I mean, I was setting out to write a suspense novel with a thriller, and it's got a lot of violent, and it's got this what I thought is sort of a chilling end. But I think it is just ingrained in me, especially in dialogue, to add some humor. That's just some sort of the natural rhythms that you're trained to think of as
Right.
as a sitcom writer. And I think also just you're also trained to sort of like cut tension with that. And if you're dealing with the front of the devil, which is I hope a very scary story, my instinct, and I think that probably comes from TV, is you want to cut things a little bit with whips and people saying what you hope are funny things.
And especially because you're working with in the characters, you're working with young people, which is just sort of naturally funny, and your protagonist has a
Wisecracky.
wisecracking mentality as well. Of course, when you're doing a TV show, there's casting, and while considering the writing of the book, does it make you think about how much is on you as the writer and how much is on the actor? Meaning, in the book, it's all you. It's up to you for that to land, whereas the process in television is you're writing and then you're handing it over to somebody, and what is that like?
That's a great question. It's interesting. Like if you're writing for a show that's already up and running, you have a cast that's already in place, and in terms of creating a character, they do have to work for you. They look a certain way and they talk a certain way, and they have a certain voice and mannerisms, all of which you are writing towards when you're a sitcom writer. And you do have to sort of I think if you're writing a TV pilot, you have to do a lot of that work as well because the actors aren't in place yet. But when you're writing a book, you have to do all that and make it visual, and you have to sort of create the characters out of whole cloth. But that's also liberating in a way because you don't have to worry about this is not really this particular actor, or this doesn't sort of it frees you up a little bit, but it also obligates you to fill in all those blanks.
Well, the name of the new novel is Friend of the Devil. Stephen Lloyd is the author. The book is published by Putnam. Stephen, what a great pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you so much for sharing with us. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
We enjoy hearing from our listeners about our show. You can email us at book@wamc.org. You can listen again to this or find past book shows via podcast or at wamc.org. Sarah LeDuc produces our program. Bookmark us for